I would like to start the discussion, and we thought that that clip would be particularly helpful when we're talking about remembering, reflecting, and reparations. We say words like enslavement, words like lynching, and it's important to know that there are human beings behind those words whose lives were impacted and destroyed. And I would like to start, if I could, with Dr. Carruthers. And Dr. Carruthers, much of the work that you have done is about preserving sacred sites. One of the things that was so important to Jo Bowling McCall is to have a marker about what happened to her father. And she described just a little bit of what she went through to get that marker put on the side of the highway. Why is that so important, the concept of preserving sacred sites?
I think the connection between remembrance and reparations is the pathway to healing. And the act of a marker is an act of remembrance. I think we should really spend the contemplative time necessary to claim those markers. The sacred books, the sacred texts talk about those markers and the remembrance of how God was with us. What becomes really important, I think, is for us to claim that with intentionality, to say that we are claiming the divinity within us by remembering those markers. And that, to the question of the last panel, it really doesn't matter what others do or not do. We don't have the right not to demand remembrance and reparations. So I sit here looking at your documentary and thinking about a few months ago developing a documentary on the Elaine massacre of 1919 in Elaine, Arkansas, in which we have named it Hush Mouth, because what the persons who experienced that terror were told to do was to hush their mouth, to go to work, and things would be all right. But the ancestors of those who were massacred, and we're talking about somewhere between known 200 to 800, massacred many in a church, women and men and children who were daring to organize around their labor and organize around their wages from selling of cotton. Massacred. So what I think is important for us to understand about the marking is that as I sit here and I think about the fact that it was the Elaine massacre, that my grandmother would tell the story around which her brother came home and said, "I'm out of here." And we got a letter 4 to 5 years later where he had settled in Brazil. So now I have 6 generations of family in Brazil, one of whom married a Nigerian. We have come full circle. But what we must do as a family is to mark and to understand the terror and the horrors and the trauma that define the nature of our personal stories and our collective stories. And that's why markers are so important. And that's why I feel so privileged to have in February facilitate leading 600 plus clergy and lay leaders to Montgomery, Alabama on a pilgrimage to stand and consecrate those sacred grounds of the National Peace and Justice Memorial of the Equal Justice Institute, as well as the Legacy Museum. We have to remember as a counter to the dismembering that we have been so silent about, but what this historic day represents as an act of breaking the silence.
I'd like to go to Dr. Malva. And I guess the question I have is history just the past? And is it dead? Or is it something else?
Well, I would commend to the audience, first of all, thank you, Pastor Lamar, for opening the church, and thank you, Dr. Ron Daniels, for your leadership and your work. Thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the ACLU for the collaboration with NARC. We really do appreciate it. Now, is the history just the past, or is it alive? It's alive and well. There's a film that I'd like to recommend that people take a look at. It's called Wilmington on Fire. It's about what happened to Wilmington in 1898. The terms were these. Black people and Republicans came together to try to create some fusion energy. There's a woman who's written a book called The Fusion Movement. White Democrats were incensed that white people would talk to black people. The only known coup d'etat that took place in this country took place in 1898 when these people called the red shirts, which were the Klan without robes, they wore red shirts instead. They went to a city council meeting and basically demanded everybody's resignation so that they could take over. But see, the other thing they did, there was a brother named Alexander Manley, and he owned the first statewide black newspaper in the state of North Carolina. He was a bad mammer jammer, and he was of mixed heritage. His dad was reported to be, I can't prove, they said his dad was probably the governor. He was very fair-skinned, blah, blah, blah. But he was a race man. So this white woman gave a speech and said, we could lynch 1,000 Negroes per day to protect the chastity of white women. Now, footnote, because I'll come back to that. Ida B. Wells began to document lynchings. Lynchings were not about interracial sex. They were about economic envy. But that was a trope. You know, these black men trying to have sex with white women. What both Manley and Ida B. Wells wrote is that Ida B. Wells documented 1/3 of lynchings were about interracial sex. The others were about economics. Of that 1/3, she asserted, half of them were consensual. And the only time it became a lynching issue is when either the white girl cried rape when she got busted, or the brother got bold. He got to hold his booth hand in public. He knew better than that. But in any case, basically, it was 1/3 and half of them were consensual. So putting that aside. So when this woman, Helen somebody or other, gave this speech, it went all over the South. And Alex Manley wrote back saying, white folks better watch their women. A, and B, y'all white men need to stop talking smack about your women when you messing with our women. Now, his piece was replicated all over the South, and it was like a price on his head. Because he basically, and I wrote about it at some length in the ACLU blog, so if you check it out today, you'll see my piece. But anyway, they replicated all over the South, so there was a price on his head. So you combine these Republicans and these fusion people, on one hand, with this brother who's basically saying white women are hoes. Excuse me, Pastor, I didn't mean to curse in church. But he used to be, so this is my church, so it's all good. But in any case, that combination gave them rise to basically, the night before they took over, arrested all the prominent black men in the town, and the next morning gave them one-way tickets out, which meant they had to get rid of they lost their property, they lost their home, they lost everything. It's documented that at least 60 people were killed, but in this film, Wilmington on Fire, they say that, you know, whites bragged that the Wilmington River was awash with black bodies. So it was probably more than 60. But just like Tulsa, we don't have an accurate count of what happened there either. So in any case, the reason why this film is impactful, Dr. Lewis Manley, who's a grandson of the Alex Manley who was run out of town, talks about what his family lost, what could have been. The fact that they were wealthy people. In fact, Wilmington, what was interesting about Wilmington in 1898 is you had a thriving black middle class. You had black businesses, you had everything that you could imagine. But all that was lost. They lost 2,500 black residents in the course of a year. They lost 25% of their black-owned businesses in the course of a year. And there are people, survivors, who you'll see in this film, It's on Vimeo. There are survivors who talk about what they lost. So it's history, but it's also very real. And so there are two aspects of reparations that we need to lift up. One is that there are instances where you can identify individuals who lost stuff. So you know that they are owed. In my own family, we have the case of what we call the moving fence. We own property in Moss Point, Mississippi. I call it Mississippi GD. Cleaning it up, y'all know what I mean. We had access to a bayou, which was very fish rich, and it was ours. We let other people use it, but it was ours. We woke up one day, the fish had moved. I mean, the fence had just moved. And they're like, we dare you to prove that this is your land. A cousin went missing. We believe that he was killed. Eventually, years later, maybe 30 years later, they named the land they took from us Hawkins Lane after our family, so that was supposed to be our reparation. So there are individuals who can show what they lost. But the bigger piece is what was the effect of lynching or Williamsburg or Tulsa on the black mindset? Because I believe that it was a deterrent to people amassing capital, it was a deterrent to people opening businesses. If you knew that opening a business could get you lynched, you're going to keep your head down. As you say, you're going to keep your head down. You're not going to open a business. You're going to be quiet. You're going to be humble. And literally, Ida B. Wells said, lynching is an act of white supremacy. And really what it did was to reinforce. And that white supremacy is alive and well. How does a policeman take a gun to a woman, a pregnant woman, because her 4-year-old walked out the 5 and dime with a doll that was worth 99 cents? I mean, come on. How does Tamir Rice, little boy, get shot? We could just call the roll of this, but it's because of white supremacy. Somebody told these people that it was okay. So the past is not gone. The past is here. What's different is that more of us are clear about what the past is, and more of us are willing to talk about it. What's also clear is that while race and poverty are overlapping things, and you have poor white people and, whatever, race and poverty are also very different things. And you see, as our economic structure, as the structure of predatory capitalism is breaking down in terms of increased number of white people who are experiencing poverty, you see people beginning to look around and ask the question, why is this the case? I mean, Dr. King said in 1968, there are 40 million poor people in America. You have to ask your question, why are there so many poor people? When you ask a question, he said, you must ask a question about the basic nature of our economy. He goes on to say, you see, who owns the oil? Who owns the iron ore? If the world is 2/3 water, why should we pay water bills? Now, don't send that to the water company. It ain't going to work. But the point is that he really was talking about economic structure. So we have a structural issue that affects everybody, and then you have a race issue that affects black folks. Both of these things are rooted in our history, and that history is not going to go away. So we had better reckon with it. And we have to reckon with it in terms, both black folks and white folks, and the rest of our nation. Our nation is built on a foundation of enslavement. There would be no United States were it not for enslavement. I call the place that the orangutan lives, I call him the orange orangutan. The orangutan lobby has asked me not to do that, but I do it anyway. But anyway, I call the place the house that enslaved people built. Because that's what it is, the house that enslaved people built. And built the Congress and built all that. And so that you can't get past that. You simply can't get past that. So the history is alive and well. We have to revisit and revisit and revisit until we fix it. And the fact is that I just come from, I'm sure that Dr. Daniels talked about the hearings where we were, and someone asked the question, why should Congress do anything to fix this? Because Congress messed it up in the first place. They would not pass legislation to prevent lynching. The NAACP went to the mat until the 1920s. Anti-lynching legislation, they wouldn't pass it. Southern senators didn't want anti-lynching legislation. What did they say then? Lynching is okay, which means economic intimidation is okay. And so that's why history still matters.
I want to pick up with one of the last things that you talked about, and go for a second to Katrina Brown, because Ms. Brown, your connection to this issue is somewhat unique. And you are the producer and director of a documentary called Traces of the Trade. Would you share with folks what that documentary is about, and maybe picking up on what Dr. Malvo was saying about our history and how important that is?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with everyone today. So the film is the result of my learning in my late 20s that my ancestors from Rhode Island were slave traders, and that they were actually the worst of the worst, which we didn't realize in my family, but a historian had studied the Rhode Island slave trade, and he did the numbers, and basically the DeWolfs, by virtue of being involved in the trade for 3 generations, were basically the single family most complicit in the slave trade of any family, north or south. And this, as you can imagine, just completely rocked my world on a couple levels. The first was learning this from my grandmother, and then realizing within moments that I already knew and had repressed it. So very quickly I learned that what I had done on this very personal level was a microcosm of what the North as a whole had done, which is amnesia about the history of Northern complicity in slavery. So I decided to make a documentary film because it felt like a story that was really important to tell. And you can imagine, like, once you start digging, there's more and more revelation. So as I shared in my testimony this morning, you know, there was slavery in the North for over 200 years. The North, Rhode Island in particular, dominated the slave trade. Ancillary businesses all across the North were tied up in slavery and the slave trade. So you had obviously the boat makers, the sail makers, the rum distillers, those who produced food that were...
The Lehman Brothers.
The Lehman Brothers in New York were cotton brokers. Insurance companies in Connecticut and New York, banks, etc. And then even on top of all of that was the fact that even once slavery and the slave trade were abolished in the North, it was raw materials from southern plantations and from the Caribbean, from the islands, that was being brought to northern factories to be processed. So the cotton mills that we all know so much about in Lowell, etc. So in every kind of way, the North was in this web, this economic system. And, the victors write the history books. So when the North wins the Civil War, which incidentally, the North did not enter the Civil War to end slavery, even if Lincoln might have had that goal, the average Northerner, in New York City, there were draft riots by white folks who did not want to join the Union and go south to have anything to do with the issue of slavery and ending slavery. So by virtue of winning the Civil War, the North writes the history books in their favor, and the story becomes, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, end of story. And in terms of how history affects the present day, I would just jump us right up to the present and say, when we ask the question of how the dynamics between the white North and the white South are unresolved and how those are still impacting the politics of this country, you suddenly see, you can't help but connect the dots between then and now in terms of the self-righteousness of the North, white Southern resentment of that self-righteousness, because white Southerners actually know more about Northern complicity than Northerners do. So they resent because we are always looking down our noses at them. And hence a lot of the politics of resentment that still plague us to this day. So the film was to document a journey to retrace the triangle trade that 10 of us in my family took in the year 2001. So I wrote to 200 relatives, 9 people signed up, and we retraced the triangle trade from Rhode Island to Ghana, to the slave forts, to Cuba, where the DeWolfs owned plantations. And we just were trying to face the past and deal with it and have lots of messy, confusing feelings and conflict and arguments and do we owe or don't we owe? And I just figured, inspired partly by Mackie Alston, who's filming me right now, who had made the film Family Name, this idea of putting a white family kind of on camera under the microscope a bit. I just knew, as you had done, that it would help. It's like if my family could face this past that was like really horrendous, maybe that would inspire other white people to face their relatively less horrendous relationship to slavery, but relationship nonetheless. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I find it just really interesting that the whole myth that you talked about in terms of the pure North and the evil South, and how the victors get to write the history. And the first ship that was built in America to go to Africa to get more enslaved people was built not in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi or Alabama, it was built in Massachusetts. And the first 3 ships that were built by America to go to Africa to get enslaved people were named the Hope, the Prosperity, and the Desire. Those were the words that white Northerners associated with the concept of owning people as property. And I now want to go to Dr. Newton, because as we have heard the different discussion, I go back to the clip that we showed, and when I asked Joe Bowling McCall about why she thought they did this to her father, and she talked about him being successful, but she said they did it for terroristic reasons, to convince other black folks don't try to be successful. And I know that one of the things that you have worked on and studied and talked about is the concept of trauma that is passed from one generation to another. And could you talk to us for a bit about how that works into the discussion we're having today?
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased and honored to be with this illustrious group of people. And thank you, Dr. Daniels, and thank all of you all for joining us, and also the pastor and members of Metropolitan. There's a phrase in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that goes, "They work on you in ways you cannot fight. They keep on and on until you are fixed." The fear is a transmissible fear that carries from one generation to another. Not only is it a conditioned response, but it's also transmitted through a genetic reaction. A lot of data on trauma and its effect on future generations has been done looking at the Jewish Holocaust. Dr. Rachel Yehuda and others at Sinai talked about how the children and the children of the children of those victims of the Nazi encampment had anxiety and fear as a result of that experience. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if a few years or a few decades happened to the Jewish people, what 400 years did to our people. And so the African that got on that boat is not the African that got off that boat. And so the changes that occurred from being on the open field near the Gambia River. I just got back from Gambia and Senegal this morning, so forgive me if I sound a little crazy. And all of a sudden one day you're snapped and you're put in the hull of a ship and you're put in darkness, people who are used to light, and you are subjected to excrement and dead carcasses. I want you to envision this with me for a minute. And you are put in a stench environment, and you then have to live through that. There are compensatory neurobiological and neurochemical and neuropsychological changes that occur as a result for us to have the luxury of today's discourse. So that those of us who sit here and intellectualize reparations are the byproduct of survivors, but at what cost? And the cost that we've had to deal with has to do with changes in our neurocircuitry, changes in our mentation, changes in our physical structures. Trauma, we now know, through many, many years of research, this is not something that needs to be studied in the context of its existence, but it has to be studied as it relates to us. We now know that those changes create physical, mental, and yes, spiritual changes in the human body. We now know that hormones that are supposed to keep you ready for fight, flight, cannot be kept up in a state of complexity 24/7, 365. So that the trauma that occurred then continues with today's microaggressions, with today's police brutality, with today's issues. We're not dealing with post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic slavery. We're dealing with complex compound slavery that continues from that generation to this generation, and for generations unborn. And so the data exists as it relates to general trauma. And so when she says about the fear of success, it is not just that fear. What it had also created in our people is a denial that they don't want to address, that I don't want to deal with this, that it really didn't happen. And then you have people who say, well, it happened to a long time ago. Our ancestors did it, but we didn't have anything personally to do with it. So we haven't also looked at the traumatic effects to the perpetrators and how that continues to play out in the perpetratory acts that continue to affect our people. So we have neurobiological changes. We have changes in the DNA. We know that men who have been traumatized, their RNA changes, not just the uterus and the embryo, but we know that these things then cause us to have adjustments that we make in order to survive. And so when we look at it, we're not looking at a single entity. We have to look at a longitudinal reality. And in addition to the genetic changes, what are the effects of the environment then and now upon the manifestation and expression of those genes? And so that's where we are. We're dealing with a complex compound situation that cannot be simply talked about in a little gist of, oh, well, we'll give you some money and that'll make it right. You will never be able to repay us for the damage that has been done in the context of what has happened to us as a people. However, having said that, there's also the issue of healing a nation, and a nation who has within its mindset a memory of historical realities that they're in denial about. These are defense mechanisms, and defense mechanisms that are pathological. And so as a result of that, if America is to heal, if America is to really make right what it did that's wrong, white people, black people, and all people are going to be affected by what happened in the sins of the father. And so I am just simply saying that the health effects, when we talk about reparations and reparatory justice, we have to talk about the then, the now, and the future, which is an African cosmology, because we deal with our historical ancestors and we pray for our next generation. So in other words, there has to be a philosophical African approach to the healing and understanding and the study and the research that needs to be done that has never been done on what happened to us and how it affects our mind, our body, and our spirit. Those hormonal changes that occur, that create the fear, that keep your cortisol levels elevated, that keep your norepinephrine elevated, also continue to keep us sick with hypertension and diabetes, despite our diet, despite our exercise, and despite the kinds of things that would help us, so that the poverty that exists and all these other things that create anxiety also creates inflammation. And that inflammation in the body causes dementia, it causes cancer, it causes all of these other health effects. So we are not just dealing with a simple problem. And these effects interact economics, interact your spirituality, interact everything. So yes, the fear is there, and so is the healing.
I am going to ask, please. I guess I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege because I have a question I need to ask you.
Yes, sir.
About an incident that I think most people are familiar with in Chicago. A young 9 or 10-year-old black child is approached by police officers. They think that a young kid has a gun. This kid has no gun. He hasn't done anything wrong. As they approach him, he runs. They chase him. He urinates all over himself.
Right.
And he is handcuffed behind his back, and they lecture him about running from the police, and they send him home. And the question that kept coming into my mind is, what is going on in the mind of that child that makes him urinate all over himself just because police want to talk to him?
Well, that's an autonomic response. I mean, you have symbolism within the television that shows you that the police are your enemy. You have symbolism in every example within your community that says, if I am young and black and police approach me, the likelihood that I'm going to die is real. And so the children are incorporating that. It gets incorporated in an early age, and it gets programmed in an early age. It is a normal response to run from something that you fear. You have the fight-flight mechanism. You either stay there to do battle, or you haul behind. And so one of the things that a child will do is run if it fears something. And so the urination, the micturition, is a normal autonomic response to a fear reaction. And so the issue, though, is how much that trauma is going to affect that child for the future, and maybe that child's child. And so that is what we have to begin to really address. The children are responding to what they have been programmed. The symbolism of police for the average African American child is not positive because we don't have community policing in the classical sense. And so the child is doing a normal reaction. He's just fine. He's either running from fear because he knows that the probability is he is going to be shot, because he's seen other children his age. And you know, there's the data that supports that black children, when they are viewed as older, even when they're the same age as white children. And so that they are more responsible. And as such, there is also the psychology of eliminating a future generation so that you don't have to compete with them again.
I was going to ask Dr. Malvo and Ms. Brown to talk a little bit more about the economic aspects that are hidden in our history. So, for example, I understand that in 1790, America was producing about 1.5 million pounds of cotton every year. And by 1860, just 70 years later, that went to 2.3 billion pounds, almost 60% of U.S. exports at that time. Is it possible to trace economic loss and damage? Is it possible to figure out how much money was made by different individuals or companies as we wrestle with these issues? And is that important? Dr. Malvo, start with you.
Well, first of all, it is absolutely possible. There are a number of economists and forensic accountants and others that have done the work to look at which companies benefited, which insurance companies, banks. The whole bond industry is based on the backs of enslaved people. So there's a very rich body of research that looks at all of this, and you can find out who did what and who earned what, who got what. Is it important? Oh, hell yeah. Oh, forgive me, Pastor, I did it again. He gonna come up here and put some holy water on me in a minute. But the reason that it's important is because, again, we have these wealth gaps, We have these companies that are publicly traded, that are making profits. They're making profit, and their foundation was on somebody's back. Some people want to say this happened a long time ago. Well, you know, if you stole something out of my house a long time ago, and I come back and get it, that's fair. Now you might stole it, and my granddaughter comes and gets it. It's still fair. You took my stuff. And so when we begin to document these folks, and which is why the young people at Georgetown, I give them very high props for what they're doing in terms of, say, they passed a tax on themselves to do reparations-related activity at Georgetown. But all the Ivies, Brown, Columbia, all of them have their roots in enslavement. And it does matter because there are folks, as you said, who would like to look at enslavement as something that was Southern. You know, we didn't have anything to do with it. Yes, you did. Not only as people who owned enslaved people, as people who participated in the shipping, who participated in every other aspect of it. And so, yes, it does make sense. Will we be made whole? I'm not going to speculate, but I'm going to say when the facts are on paper, it changes the ways that we can look at certain things. And then let me say this as well, because this is very important for us to also look at. If you look at the complexion of Black America, see, people keep telling me to do that DNA 23 stuff. I ain't looking for my white folks. I ain't looking for them. So I'm not giving anybody any spit or blood so I can find some white folks that are related to me. I am not that interested. But when slave importation stopped, the form of reproduction was white men raping Black women. That's just what it was. And we could clean it up. I mean, somebody wants to tell you that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson were in love. Well, how do you say to Massa, Massa, I have a headache. Not tonight. I mean, I don't think you really quite get to do that. So there are other kinds of complicity that we also have to own. And the range of complexion in our community is not so much about consensual relationships between white men and Black women, but about someone's predatory capitalist need to essentially multiply the population for the benefit of exploitation. See, some of these people had no hearts or souls. They sold their children.
Yeah.
And they didn't mind selling their children because and they sometimes even accounted it in their books. But all of this stuff, between computers and forensic records and the census, we can document much of this. The question is how much time, effort, and energy we want to put into documenting it, how much time, effort, and energy we put into the revolutionary activity, that which I think makes us more whole when we resist enslavement, resist contemporary enslavement, resist the entirety of the predatory capitalist undermining of our country. When we do that, that makes us whole too. So I want the historians to do their work. I want us to know what's up, but I also want us to know that there are some other things we can do to repair ourselves. We will have, as Bob and Patricia has mentioned, the physiological response to that which we have experienced. Not to mention people tell you stuff, and that stuff becomes internalized.
That's right.
You know, I mean, my mom told me once, when I bought my Lexus, actually, she said, why would you buy a Lexus now people will know you have money? I was like, yeah. And I wanted a red convertible my whole life, so when I got the money, I got me one. But basically, her lesson was live under the radar. You know, don't stand up, don't stand out. And when she heard that the convertible was red, she really had a fit. You know, she said, now the police are going to stop you every day. I'm like, what's new? You know, what's new? I just cuss them out, you know, because I'm a female. Brothers can't do that. Well, you can cuss them out. They won't, well, they might. But anyway, but the bottom line is we internalize messages about our oppression. And so one of the ways we begin to unpack this is to really deal with who did what. Yeah. So if you knew that, as an example, Metropolitan Life Insurance Company was a major actor in enslavement, would you buy insurance from them? Just saying.
Sure. I guess the point I would want to make on this question is the importance of looking both at the, for example, the corporations or the families or the universities, the way major institutions benefited, but not to do so to the exclusion of really driving home the point that regular, everyday, average people were complicit in this system, because it's so easy for white Americans to say that they weren't like my family and to think that gets them off the hook. But when you look at everything from the factory workers at those textile mills to all the sort of forms of ancillary participation in that economy that I was talking about, and very importantly to consumers, it's like you could not be here in this country at that time and not be buying cotton or sugar or coffee or tobacco or rice. So if you were consuming those products, you were complicit in the slave economy. And there's a way in which, if we don't emphasize that, I think it gives, in a sense, permission to those who want to deny their connection with it. The other big distancing myth is this idea of my people came after slavery, so I had nothing to do with it. And as I shared in my testimony this morning, I not only have slave trading ancestors, I have lots of ancestors. That includes German, French, Irish immigrants who came at the turn of the 19th century, 20th century, and had that classic story of working in factories, struggling, having to really work their way up. So that story of we worked hard and we came after slavery needs to be re-examined, because the whole reason people immigrated here for jobs was because there were jobs. And the whole reason there were jobs is because it was a booming economy. And the whole reason it was a booming economy is because it was built on unpaid labor. So, and that really, I think, flips the script for a lot of people. And it doesn't have to mean denying that your people worked hard and struggled, and there were plenty of people who faced anti-Semitism or anti-Catholic sentiment. So it's not to deny what they went through, but it's both and, it's not either or.
Dr. Malvo, you have one other thing.
Yeah, I want to just briefly also talk about the structure of our economy and the structure of American history. And I think it's really important that we not personalize it in terms of it was this family or that person. It's an economic structure that allowed enslavement to occur. And even the concurrence of immigrants, which there was concurrence, was about the economic structure in a predatory capitalist society that allows people to extract surplus value wherever they can. And so the reality of enslavement was you were able to basically extract surplus value, and that formerly enslaved people at the turn of the century were used as strike breakers and others essentially to suppress the wages of white immigrants, because you always have the notion that if we strike, the black folks are going to come and take our jobs. So this pitting of people against each other around employment is as ancient as the founding of this nation. Right. But I want us to think about structure when we think about these things, and focus on structure as opposed to a lot of folks want to take it to a micro level, but it's really a macro structural issue.
Dr. Rose, I wanted to ask you if you had a comment on this, and then I have another question for you, but go ahead first.
Well, I did have a thought that bridged this conversation, which is that we also have to begin to not just do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of the economic but also in terms of the psychology and the spiritual consequences of this. I think the intersection of faith and psychiatry is this pathway to healing. So when we talk about epigenetics and the consequences it has on those of us who are the victims, who have been subjected to centuries of this terror and horror, I think we also have to spend some time to assess what it means in terms of identity delusion on those who control the very systems that created this cost-benefit analysis requirement. And so when you speak about the cosmology of Africa and the past, the present, and the future, I'm thinking about this in terms as well of what it means to be human. So what is it about the differential cost of the soul and the spirit and the psychology of this experiment called the building of this democracy that has consequential damage on what it means about the identity, the delusional identity of persons who have been the beneficiaries of this system, of those who have dominated by virtue of their white privilege. I think that's another conversation that has to be had if we're going to have an honest conversation about reparatory justice towards transformation and not just some kind of superficial reconciliation.
Amen.
Dr. Lee, I was going to ask a question, but I saw you write it. And so is there something you wanted
No,
to
I
add?
just said amen to the 10th time.
Dr. Carlos, I was going to ask if you would mind addressing just for a moment. You have talked about sacred sites, and there are a plethora of Confederate monuments all over this country. Most of them, the vast majority in the South, but there are some in the North, there are some in the West, they're all over the country. Do you have a view on what those monuments mean and what is trying to be preserved by those monuments?
Well, I think in some ways it is fake news to talk about separation of religion and state. And once we have an assumption that there has always been complicity based on this nation's understanding of what it meant to be religious, then we understand that those monuments are sacred sites and extensions of that complicity. And so, you know, those prayers at the top of the boat were not the same prayers at the bottom of the boat. And as a result of that, I think we should understand that those sacred sites are differentially perceived as well. So part of the simple answer to your question is, will America face up to the truth? Will it get over its amnesia, its delusion, because there is no doubt that a requirement, a requisite for the reparatory justice would be to confront the truth of what those sites really represent and to atone for them and take them down and consecrate the taking of them down as evidence of a transformed nation.
Not only do I agree with her, but the symbolism that gets imprinted in the mind would have to be also altered as a result of that, because when you see those monuments, you begin to think that this is the appropriate history. And truth is whatever you believe it is, but fact is what it is regardless of what you believe. And the facts are that these represent oppressive regimes that terrorize and demonize human beings and attempted to destroy them for the benefit of profit.
So I told you buckle your seatbelts. I would like us to thank this panel of 4 women who have given us incredible knowledge. And I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Daniels, who is going to introduce our last presenter of the day.
If I were you, I wouldn't move, because you get ready to hear the preeminent public intellectual on this issue of reparations in the world today. Is everybody all right? Are y'all all right? Y'all don't sound like y'all all right now. This is the beginning of this is a great day. And we just had another very powerful. Let's give it up again for that panel. Let's give it up for Jeffrey Robinson. And we're actually going to conclude a little early. We're moving right along. We had anticipated a time for a closure, but we're going to move that up a bit. So now it's my privilege to bring to address you all the way from Jamaica, who thought it not robbery, as they say in the church, to take up his time to be with us today. I get this microphone straightened out. I'm not good at it necessarily. He is the Vice Chancellor, which in Caribbean terms means the President of the University of the West Indies. The entire system. He previously served as the President of the University of West Indies in Barbados. But we have brought him here today because he is a man who talks about having been inspired actually by the movement here in this country, particularly James Foreman, to talk about reparatory justice. A few years ago, the 15 nations of the Caribbean courageously took the step of demanding of the former colonial powers reparations for native genocide, and that was so important from a principal point of view, and African enslavement. And in so doing, they created a CARICOM Reparations Commission. And they chose as the person to lead that commission, the person who comes to address you now. And they chose him because he has the rare gift of being an extraordinary historian. Just talking to him today, he was just revealing as we were on our way. He unpacks stuff. Story after story after story of what has happened to our people. But he also buttresses it with a narrative about what that means. And with a challenge for what it is that we must do into the future if we are to create a world where there is no exploitation by human beings by human beings. He has spoken at Cambridge, he's spoken to the European Congress, he has spoken to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, he's spoken at Harvard and Yale and all across the country. But today he's come to address you on this momentous day of a public hearing on H.R. 40 and a hearing, a forum here on healing, reconciliation and healing, and the promise for reparations for African Americans. Would you please welcome Professor Hillary Echols, the chairperson of the CARICOM Reparations Commission.
Give our sisters another round of applause for that. I've come a long way today, and I feel like being in a pulpit. I'm not sure this is the real thing. You know, there's another place up there. Okay, folks. Allow me to say that I was born in a little Caribbean island we call Barbados. And that's important. And the importance of that will become clearer as I go along. Because Barbados was the Wall Street of slavery. And it's important to feel the significance of that. I will speak about that as I go along, because I am not here from over the waters. I am here from Barbados and Jamaica because there is a black nation. There is a black nation that runs from one end of this hemisphere to the other. There is something called Plantation America that runs from Georgia all the way to Argentina. All of us black folk, are part of Plantation America. And our experiences have been the same. Whether it was Alabama, Mississippi, Jamaica, Barbados, Brazil, it has been the same experience for all of us. And all of us are family, and I will speak about family, and I will speak about family from the point of view of Barbados, because, you know, in Barbados, when the Africans ran away and they were caught, if they were persistent offenders and they were punished, do you know what happened to them? They were sent to South Carolina. They were sent to Virginia. They were deported off the island and scattered across this country. So you and I are cousins and might very well be. But that's the nature of history. I want to speak about that. I'm here in Washington. Do you know that George Washington, before he became the president, there was a moment when he wasn't feeling very well, and where did he go to recover? He went to Barbados with his family to relax for 2 months. So I am now here from Barbados and Washington to work this through. The history connects us all, and I wish to speak about that connection. I am the other half of Dr. Malveaux. Did you hear that, Dr. Malveaux? I'm your other half. Her discipline is economics. The historians have never been happy with the economists because the economists look at the world as it is today. The historians look at the world as it used to be. It required your imagination to realize that historians and economists ought to get together. And which is why my discipline is economic history. That's why I'm her other half. The merger of economics and history. And that brings me again to Barbados. Barbados was the first society in this hemisphere where Africans were the majority. It's the first society in the whole of the Americas where Africans were the majority. The second society in the hemisphere where Africans were the majority was South Carolina. And South Carolina was founded by Barbadian slave owners. You see the connections? South Carolina was founded by the slave owners of Barbados who wanted more room to expand and to grow. And so they took possession of South Carolina. Again, the connection. We are speaking about the economics of slavery and its legacy, and this is where I wish to discuss Malveau's analysis. Barbados was the first place in this hemisphere where white folks realized that you could bring thousands of African folks across an ocean, place them on a farm, beat the hell out of them, and make a profit. That model, the Barbados model, became the model for the rest of this hemisphere. That you could go to West Africa, terrorize the communities there, extract thousands of persons, put them on a slave ship, bring them across an ocean for 2 months, land them in a place, drive them to hard labor, and make a profit 10 times greater than if you had invested your money in government bonds, in agriculture, and what have you. Once that model was established, it became a blueprint for every white person in this hemisphere who wanted to make a quick buck, break all the rules of humanity, drive people into the ground where mortality doesn't matter, make a profit, and become a successful citizen. Now, they were not brought across the Atlantic for show, to dance and sing. They were brought here for economic purposes, economic reasons, and we have to feel the sense of that, because unless you understand the economics of this matter, you will misunderstand the future. Now, of course, we can take you through this step by step. How it was calculated, how the analysis was made, how much you paid for a male African in West Africa, how much you paid for a female, the shipping costs across the Atlantic, the mortality costs, the landing price, the auction prices, the movement to the estate, 10 years of labor, then you die, you replace that person, increase productivity. We can take you through the economics of that process, because at the end of the day, the balance sheet had to show a profit. You're not going to go through all of that not to make a profit. It is about profit. And it is about the role of government in establishing that system to allow citizens to make that profit within the laws of the nation. The government created the framework, the legislative framework, the business framework, the trade policies, the trade laws. All of that was put in place by the government to allow citizens to maximize their profit from the employment of free African labor. The role of the government, the role of the state. The role of the state in framing and sustaining that structure for 400 years. Now, I want you to be aware and be aware of the concept which is called the national interest. The most wicked and heinous things have been done in the name of the national interest. And this is why I say this. From the moment the slave trade started, from the moment enslavement started, there were people in Europe, in this country, in the Caribbean, there were always people who were saying, this is wrong. This is criminal. This is immoral. This is sinful. All of those languages were used to describe this thing that was happening. But guess what? The government and its officials and supporters and the investors all said it might be. It might be sinful. It might be criminal. It might be immoral. But guess what? It is in the national interest. And all of those folks, all of that opposition was blown away. Social morality blown away. Human values blown away. Concepts of citizenship and justice blown away, because what was coming through was the juggernaut of the national interest. And this is important, because that same concept will apply in our time to the issue of reparations. That very concept is going to be dusted off and used again when the state of this country begins to look at the question of reparation. Is it in the national interest? And the question is, who will own that national interest? Who will define it? Who will be the ones who define what the national interest is? In the context of slavery, it was the royal family of Great Britain and Europe, for the merchants, the investors. Those are the ones who capture the concept of the national interest and ram it down the throat of all of the other citizens. This is something that you will have to watch. And so here we are today, celebrating this moment in our movement. There are always seminal moments in every great movement. And today is one such moment. And there will be other moments. Some of them will be a step forward. Some of them will be 2 steps back. But it is a movement. And it is a movement that is 400 years old. From the moment the first Africans arrived in this hemisphere, the reparations movement started. It started from day one. And it has been galloping. It has been galloping century by century. When we look at the history of this process, you realize that it took us 300 years to uproot slavery from this hemisphere. It took 300 years of 300 years of the most aggressive and focused black movement to uproot slavery from this hemisphere, and we succeeded. It took us 300 years. But we never gave up. Thousands of our people died in the process. We know the history. We know the history of the murdering of our people across the lands of this hemisphere. A day did not go by that our people were not killed in large numbers in that period. But that struggle continued until slavery was finally abolished in Brazil in the 1880s. The Haitians we know paid the greatest price. They abolished slavery with their revolution. A decade did not go by. A decade did not go by in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries unless there was a major black rebellion somewhere in this hemisphere. Somewhere in this hemisphere. Somewhere there was a major revolt of African people. Somewhere. Decade by decade by decade until we got the work done. Then it took us another 100 years to put in place fundamental civil rights. Another 100 years. From the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, another 100 years, our struggle continued for basic human rights. Another 100 years. So here we are now in the 21st century. It took us all of the 19th century to end chattel slavery. All of the 20th century to have our civil rights and our human rights legislated. Another 100 years. And now we have this 21st century ahead of us. We have this long 21st century ahead of us. This is the century of reparations. This is it. This is it. This is it.